Have you ever stood in a room where people smiled at you, but secretly plotted your downfall? 2 months after I buried my husband, my own children called a board meeting. They told me it was to support me, but really they wanted me to sign away everything Douglas and I had built. They thought I'd be too broken to notice, too tired to fight back. But they didn't realize I had one final card to play. And when I laid it on the table, the entire room went silent. I always imagined my husband's funeral would be the hardest day of my life. I pictured myself shattered, lost without the man who had stood beside me through every season of struggle. But as I stood inside that grand chapel, I realized it wasn't sorrow that clenched my chest. It was something far colder. Disbelief. Disgust. And beneath it all, a quiet flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. My name is Lorraine Curtis. I'm 54 years old, widow to Douglas Curtis, co-founder of Curtis & Co. A construction company we built from nothing but grit, sleepless nights, and a dream too stubborn to die. 32 years of marriage had just come to an end, not with a soft goodbye, but with a brutal stillness that swallowed every corner of my world. Yet standing there in my black dress in front of that closed casket, I wasn't allowed my grief. Not properly. Because even before the hymns faded, I heard whispers. And they weren't prayers. It started just behind my left shoulder. A familiar male voice lowered to what he thought was a discreet murmur, but to a mother's ears, clear as day. She's vulnerable now. This is our window. That was Spencer, my son, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had cradled through fevers, who cried in my arms after his first heartbreak, who called me Mama with those soft eyes I thought would never turn cold. Beside him was his wife, the ever-calculating Miranda. Her tone was syrupy, but her words were venom. "She's been holding the company too long, Spencer. You heard what the lawyers said. Without Douglas, she'll crumble. It's time." And from a few steps further, I caught another voice. Madison, my daughter, chatting with her husband, Leo, dressed in their designer mourning clothes. "Mom's too fragile for this. She needs guidance and someone to handle the company. She won't fight us." I stood frozen, fingers tightening around the smooth clutch I hadn't let go of all morning. I'd walked into that church expecting tears, condolences, maybe even a few half-hearted praises about Douglas's sharp business sense. But this was a coup d'etat at my husband's funeral. I felt the weight of 3 decades press on my ribs, 32 years of waking up at 4 a.m. to get concrete orders in on time, 32 years of strapping on steel-toe boots while heavily pregnant so we could keep payroll moving, 32 years of building Curtis & Co. from a leaky storage unit behind a strip mall to one of the most respected construction firms in the region. And in less than an hour after Douglas was lowered into the ground, my own children had written me off as weak. Replaceable. I turned slow and deliberate. Spencer's polished shoes came into view first, followed by the smug tilt of his jawline, too similar to his father's, but lacking any of the heart. Miranda's lips were curved in a sympathetic smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. Madison was standing just beyond them, checking her phone, already disconnected from the grief I was drowning in. Careful, I said, my voice even, but edged with steel. The walls in churches have a way of revealing what the soul tries to hide. Spencer blinked. Miranda faltered, but Madison rolled her eyes as though I was an elderly woman blabbering nonsense. I didn't push further. Not there, not on Douglas's day. I just let them stew in the knowledge that I had heard them. Every word, every plan. I stood through the remaining service, tuning out the scripted eulogies, the pastor's hollow comfort. My eyes drifted to the wooden beams of the church's high ceiling, the same beams Douglas and I once admired during a renovation bid, remarking on their craftsmanship. My mind drifted back to our early days when money was tight and dreams were all we had. I remembered the winter mornings when our kids were bundled in sleeping bags in the back seat of our pickup truck because we couldn't afford childcare. I remembered making coffee in a thermos and splitting it between 2 paper cups As we stood side by side on half-frozen job sites, I remembered Douglas's rough hand squeezing mine, whispering, "Just a little longer, Lorraine. One more job, one more contract. We'll make it." And we did. Together. Douglas wasn't a perfect man. God knows we had our share of fights, our screaming matches over missed dance recitals, over forgotten anniversaries, over whether we were doing the right thing for the kids by building a company that consumed our lives. But through all of it, we were partners. He respected my business sense, he leaned on my judgment, and he knew without a doubt that Curtis & Co. was as much my lifeblood as it was his. So standing in that church, watching mourners shake my hand with meaningless sympathy, hearing my children plotting like circling vultures, I didn't feel the expected despair. I felt insulted. I felt robbed. Not just by death, but by the betrayal blossoming in the very family I had sacrificed everything to nurture. When the final hymn ended and the last amen echoed through the hall, I walked behind the casket, past the stairs, and out into the brittle autumn air. I watched as Douglas was lowered into the ground, his name etched into marble, years summed up in 2 dates with a dash in between. I thought about how that dash held a lifetime of sweat, of struggles, of late nights, negotiating deals while the kids complained about missed birthdays. And I thought about how quickly that legacy was being eyed like a prize in a will, not a memory to be honored. As we moved toward the reception, I overheard Miranda again. "Mom's going to need support. We should talk to the board. Help her transition out." Transition out, as if I was a worn-out secretary being offered early retirement. Spencer approached me with a fake concern etched across his perfectly groomed features. "Mom, we'll talk soon, all right, about the company, about next steps. Let's not rush anything, but we're here to make sure you're..." "Okay." I smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile that board members once called my closing smile, the one I used when sealing a deal where I held all the cards. "Oh, we'll talk," I said softly, "but not the way you think." As they left in their expensive cars chatting animatedly, probably plotting the next phase of their takeover, I stood alone by Douglas's grave. I whispered, "They think I'm done, Doug. They think I'm next. But they've forgotten. I didn't just stand beside you. I built this with you. I carried the weight when you couldn't. And I'm not finished." A gust of wind rattled the drying leaves around me, a fitting applause for the silent promise I had just made. Because they had fired the first shot at their father's funeral. But this war belonged to me. And I already knew I wasn't going to lose. A month passed since Douglas's funeral, and if I thought the silence of the house would be the hardest adjustment, I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't the quiet hallways or the absence of his coffee mug sitting by the sink. It was the relentless, suffocating swirl of phone calls, paperwork, and constant pressure from every direction. People talk about grieving like it's a time to rest, to reflect, to heal. That wasn't my reality. From the moment I woke up each day, it was lawyers calling about estate matters, accountants reminding me of tax deadlines, property managers asking for decisions on pending projects. I barely had time to remember to eat, let alone grieve. But I kept showing up. Every single morning I was at Curtis & Co., just as I had been for 3 decades. I answered every email signed, every check walked, every job site. I ran the company like my life depended on it because in many ways it did. The business wasn't just my livelihood. It was my purpose, my history, the monument to everything Douglas and I had built together. And yet it wasn't long before the cracks in my world started showing, not from grief, but from betrayal creeping under the surface. It started subtly, little things. Clients I had long-standing relationships with suddenly became harder to reach. Contractors we'd worked with for years were hesitant over the phone. And most unsettling, some of our own senior staff seemed unusually cautious around me. Their voices strained in meetings, their eyes flickering with something I hadn't seen before. Doubt. At first, I brushed it off as the aftershocks of Douglas's passing. People expected some disruption after the loss of a founder. But soon it became undeniable. Something was happening behind the scenes, and I needed to find out what. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I returned to the office after a brutal negotiation with a difficult supplier, my assistant, Kendra, who had been by my side for nearly 12 years, hesitated outside my office door. She was always the picture of professionalism, never prying, always efficient. But that day, her hands fidgeted and her expression gave her away. "Come in, Kendra," I said quietly. She closed the door behind her and lowered her voice. "Lorraine, I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I think you need to know. Spencer's been calling people." I didn't flinch. "What people?" "Clients," she said. "Partners, even some of the senior staff here. He's telling them things. That you're struggling since Douglas passed. That the company's direction is unclear. That he's stepping in to provide stability." There was a heaviness in her words, but more than that, there was sadness in her eyes. I could tell she hated being the one to say it aloud. "And Madison?" I asked, already bracing for the answer. Kendra nodded. "She's been meeting with HR, asking about executive authority, floating questions about early succession plans." I sat back in my chair, pressing my fingertips together. They weren't wasting any time. Barely a month had passed since they buried their father, and already they were positioning themselves for a takeover. But Kendra wasn't finished. This morning, she continued. "Evelyn Shaw called me. She said you should check your personal email." My heart gave a small, painful thud. Evelyn wasn't just any employee. She'd been with us since year 5, one of the first women I hired when we could finally afford to expand our operations. She had started as a junior project manager and worked her way up to one of our most respected site leads. She wasn't the type to gossip or meddle. If she reached out, it was serious. I opened my inbox, and there it was. An email from Evelyn, short and simple. "We've heard the rumors. We've been approached, some of us even pressured. Just know, not everyone is against you. You're the reason this company exists. You're the reason we're proud of what we do. We've got your back." Quietly, but firmly. I blinked back, an unexpected rush of emotion. In a month filled with disappointment and backstabbing, those words felt like a hand reaching out in a storm. I sat quietly for a moment, letting that feeling settle in my chest. I replied simply, "Thank you, Evelyn. I'm going to fix this." But knowing and proving were two very different things. I spent the next few days methodically digging into internal records. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I smiled during meetings, shook hands with clients, and kept my head down. But behind closed doors, I traced email chains, cross-referenced call logs, and quietly looped in our IT security team. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Spencer had contacted at least 4 major clients, implying I was distraught and emotionally unfit to make strategic decisions. Madison had arranged a private dinner with one of our board consultants, spinning a narrative about transitioning to a younger, more dynamic leadership. Worse yet, they'd already reached out to a local equity group discussing the opportunity to acquire Curtis & Country at a discounted valuation. It was like watching termites in a home you spent your life building, quietly gnawing away at the beams, thinking no one would notice until the whole structure collapsed. I knew I couldn't confront them yet. It was too early, and they would deny everything. No, if I wanted to fight this, I needed proof. Clear, undeniable evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, not just emotional appeals about loyalty or family. I activated call recordings on all company lines. I had Kendra discreetly monitor appointment bookings. I worked with our legal advisor, Vivian Cross, to ensure all surveillance stayed within ethical and legal bounds. Every step I took was measured calm and deliberate, and the evidence kept piling up. I discovered Spencer scheduled private calls with 2 of our key international partners, falsely stating the company's financials were slipping. Madison had sent unofficial proposals to buyers under a private email account suggesting Curtis and Homo Koto was ripe for acquisition due to a leadership vacuum. It was personal. It was vicious. But it wasn't going to break me. In the evenings, I would sit by myself in the house that now felt too big in the quiet that felt too heavy and reread Evelyn's email. I would remember Douglas's voice from a year ago when we first discussed succession planning. Don't trust comfort, Lorraine. Trust preparation. And so I prepared. I wasn't going to let my children I had sacrificed everything for, erase me from my own legacy. I wasn't going to let them cheapen 3 decades of backbreaking work for a quick payday. I wasn't going to be bullied out of my seat at the head of the table by people who had never even built the table. So I kept my smile in public. I stayed quiet while they plotted. But privately, I was building my case. Because one thing they forgot, you don't go to war with a woman who knows where every brick is laid. And I was just getting started. The 3rd week after uncovering the schemes, I found myself standing in the doorway of Douglas's office. I hadn't stepped into that room since the morning of his funeral. I had avoided it, pretending I was too busy. But deep down, I knew why I stayed away. That room was more than an office. It was where our dreams had been shaped, where our late-night arguments turned into groundbreaking deals, where Douglas spent hours poring over blueprints with his reading glasses sliding down his nose. It still smelled like his cologne. Woodsy, clean, dependable. But I wasn't there to wallow in memories. I was there for answers. The mahogany desk stood just as he left it. Files were stacked neatly on one side. A half-used notebook sat open with scribbled reminders about roofing materials and pending inspections. His favorite pen rested diagonally across it. Everything was frozen in time, waiting for a hand that would never return. I moved to the cabinet behind his chair, fingers tracing the edges of its brass handles. Douglas was a creature of habit. He always kept important files close, but out of reach of anyone else. I opened the top drawer. Tax files, permits, project notes. Nothing unusual. Then the second drawer. Contracts, vendor agreements, legal correspondences. But it was the 3rd drawer that made my breath hitch. Tucked neatly against the left side, secured in a dark leather folder, was an envelope with my name in his handwriting. Bold, steady strokes. For Lorraine, in case I'm gone. My throat tightened. I slid the folder out carefully, walked back to the couch, and sat down. My fingers hesitated on the seal before I broke it open. Inside, there were neatly organized documents, each marked with tabs and notes in his handwriting. The first page was a letter. Lorraine. If you are reading this, I'm sorry. I fought as hard as I could, but we always knew there was a chance the years of wear and tear would catch up to me. This company was never just mine. It was always ours. And if something happens to me, I need you to know I trust you to carry it forward just as we always planned. I blinked rapidly, willing the tears to stay put, but they were stubborn. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. The next section was clear-cut legal documentation, a formal amendment to our corporate charter signed, notarized, and witnessed. The language was ironclad. Douglas had ensured it. In the event of his passing operational authority over Curtis & Co., would transfer fully to me. There would be no required consultation, no division of ownership. I would have unilateral control over all company decisions, including the power to appoint or remove board members, execute contracts, and restructure assets without consent from any shareholder, including our children. There was more. A clause Douglas had insisted on months after his 2nd hospital visit. If any heir initiated legal action against me or attempted to undermine the company's operations, they would automatically forfeit any claim to inheritance, monetary or business-related. I pressed my palm to my chest, feeling my heart thud beneath it. Douglas hadn't just thought about the company's survival. He had thought about protecting me from exactly what was unfolding. The betrayal, the manipulation, the greed of children who had grown too comfortable with the idea of entitlement. I flipped through the next sections. Copies of revised wills letters to our attorney Vivian Cross, even updated emergency contacts for company banks and key clients. He had written notes in the margins. Lorraine handles this best. Spencer tends to overpromise. Caution on his involvement. Madison. Interested in appearances, not substance. Protect the team. They built this with us. Every word cut through me, but not in pain. It was clarity. Douglas had seen this coming. He knew me better than I gave him credit for. While I was focused on keeping him comfortable, keeping him fighting through his illness, he was quietly ensuring I wouldn't have to fight alone if the worst happened. I don't know how long I sat there just reading and rereading the pages. Somewhere between the second and third reading, I felt the walls I had built around my grief finally crumble. I let my head fall into my hands and I cried. But not the quiet, ladylike sobs I had mastered over the years of holding it together for the family. This time it was raw and loud, shaking my entire frame. I cried because I missed him more than I thought possible. I cried because the house felt like a hollow shell without his booming laugh and his ridiculous late-night snack runs. I cried because no one told me how lonely power could feel, especially when you had to wield it against your own children. But more than anything, I cried because for the first time since he left, I realized Douglas was still standing beside me. In every note, every safeguard, every thoughtful instruction he left behind. He hadn't abandoned me to fight this alone. When the tears finally slowed, I took a shaky breath and began sorting through the documents methodically. There were checklists. Exact steps Douglas suggested I take in the first 3 months after his passing. Lists of trustworthy contacts in every department, a financial audit plan, a suggestion to implement an employee stock program, something we had always dreamt of but postponed thinking we'd have more time. And there it was, on a yellow sticky note, attached to the final page of the corporate control clause. You'll need this sooner than you think. Don't hesitate. I smiled through my tears. That was so Douglas. Direct, confident, always thinking 3 moves ahead. I gathered the papers, placed them back into the leather folder, and stood up straighter than I had in weeks. The fear, the self-doubt, the guilt. It hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something else settle into my bones. Certainty. I walked back into my office, locked the folder inside my personal safe, and placed a call to Vivian Cross. Vivian, it's Lorraine. We need to talk. I said, my voice steadier than it had been in a long time. I was hoping you'd call, Vivian replied warmly. Douglas said you would. And just like that, the plan was set into motion. Grief could wait, sentiment could wait, but the company, our legacy, my dignity, would not wait any longer. And I was ready to take back every inch of it. Some people think revenge is loud, that it comes with slamming doors, raised voices, courtroom shouting matches. But I learned early on in business that the loudest person in the room rarely wins. True power moves in silence. And this time I wasn't just fighting for my company. I was fighting for the years I'd sacrificed, for the dignity they tried to strip away, and I was going to do it without a single scream. Vivian Cross met me at my house on a quiet Thursday morning. She walked in wearing her usual crisp gray suit, carrying a briefcase that seemed heavier than normal. Her smile was soft, but her tone, as always, was direct. Let's get started, she said, setting her case down on my kitchen table. Over steaming mugs of black coffee, we laid out the full extent of what Douglas had left me. I showed her every document, every signed clause, every note scribbled in his familiar handwriting. By the end of it, her lips were pressed into a thin line, equal parts satisfaction and determination. You have everything you need to shut this down, Lorraine, she said, flipping through the legal amendments. But we're not just going to stop them, we're going to make sure they never get another chance. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Over the next few days, Vivian and I worked in quiet harmony, reconstructing the company's legal structure piece by piece. She re-verified the succession documents, initiated a full financial audit to ensure no hidden transactions had been made behind my back, and began drafting what would soon be a complete ownership restructure. It was precise, deliberate work, and every night I went to bed knowing we were one step closer to locking the doors Spencer and Madison had been so eager to kick open. But I knew I couldn't do this with lawyers alone. Curtis & Company wasn't just contracts and ledgers, it was people. People who had stood by my side when Douglas and I were eating cheap takeout at our desks, too broke to pay ourselves, too stubborn to give up. So I started reaching out quietly, one person at a time. The first call I made was to Mark Ellison. Mark wasn't just our senior project manager. He was family in every way that mattered. He'd joined us 20 years ago as a fresh-faced kid who barely knew how to hold a blueprint the right way up. I'd trained him personally, watched him grow from a clumsy intern to one of the sharpest minds in construction. He was loyal, hardworking, and most importantly, he understood the soul of the company better than anyone except Douglas and me. When he answered the phone, his voice was steady as always, but there was a hesitancy I'd never heard before. "Mark," I said, cutting straight to it. "I know there's been talk. I know you've probably heard whispers from Spencer and Madison. I just need to hear it from you. Where do you stand?" There was a brief pause, then a deep sigh. "Lorraine," he said quietly, "I've worked here half my life. I've seen every deal, every job site, every sleepless night you and Douglas put in. I know who built this place. I'm with you. Always have been. Always will be." I felt something warm settle in my chest. Something I hadn't felt since Douglas passed. Not just relief. Solidarity. "Good," I said, my voice steadying. "Because I'm making changes, and I want you right next to me when I do." From there, I worked my way down the list. Evelyn Shaw, who had been with us since the early expansion years. Juan Alvarez, our head of safety, who had once saved us from $1 million lawsuit with his sharp eye. Carol Dixon, the financial controller who knew our books better than she knew her own backyard. The Moz. Every conversation was different, but the message was the same. People were worried, confused by the swirling rumors, uncertain about the company's direction. But beneath that uncertainty was a current of trust, of belief in me, in what we had built. And when I told them what I planned to do, when I explained the ownership transition, the restructure, the protection plan, not just for me but for the company and everyone who had poured their blood and sweat into it, I felt that trust solidify. By the end of that week, my quiet army was taking shape. Vivian helped me draft a formal proposal transitioning Curtis & Company into an employee-owned company. Not a vanity project, not a PR stunt. Real ownership, real shares, real voting power. Centième. Employees who had stood through the storms with us would now hold a piece of what they helped build. They would no longer be just workers. They would be stakeholders, decision-makers, true partners. The logic was simple. The people who built the company were the people who cared most about its future. Not the entitled heirs who saw it as a golden inheritance, not the corporate sharks Spencer had been schmoozing, but the men and women who got up at dawn, who stood in the rain on job sites, who made the impossible happen day after day. I spent late nights reviewing the numbers with Carol, mapping out share allocations, reviewing tenure performance commitment. It wasn't easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. But by the time we were done, we had a clear, sustainable model that rewarded loyalty, hard work, and long-term investment in the company's success. Meanwhile, Vivian worked on the final legal safeguards, fortifying the succession clauses, locking down voting rights, and drafting ironclad protections against hostile takeovers, especially from individuals already proven to be acting in bad faith. Throughout it all, I kept up appearances. I still attended board calls, still answered emails, still nodded politely during Spencer's awkward attempts to check in over the phone. I let them believe I was adrift, that I was easy prey, because when this all came to light, it wouldn't be with shouting or angry phone calls. It would be with signed contracts, notarized agreements, and legal filings they couldn't undo. I hadn't built this company on drama or theatrics. I built it on strategy, endurance, and quiet strength. And now I was doing exactly what I had always done, protecting what mattered, building something stronger from the rubble they thought they could leave me in. One evening, as I finished reviewing the last of the new corporate bylaws, I sat back and stared out the window of my study. The streetlights glowed softly, the world outside settling into its nightly hush. I sipped my tea and let a quiet smile curve across my lips. They thought I'd break. But they had no idea. I was just beginning. By the time 2 months had passed since Douglas's funeral, I could sense the storm building. The silence around the office wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was the quiet before impact. Meetings were happening behind closed doors without me. Phone calls ended abruptly when I walked into a room, and my inbox seemed to get oddly quiet, while whispers swirled just out of earshot. Then came the inevitable, an email from Spencer's assistant, dressed up in formal language, but with an unmistakable undertone. We'd like to schedule a board discussion regarding Curtis & Company's future leadership direction and potential transitional opportunities. I read it once, then again, allowing myself a small knowing smile. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was still in mourning, lost in grief, vulnerable and tired. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last month arming myself with more than just legal documents. I had fortified my foundation, gathered my allies, and sharpened every tool at my disposal. So when the day of the meeting arrived, I was ready. The boardroom at Curtis & Co. looked the same as always. Polished mahogany table, large panoramic windows overlooking the main industrial yard, the company's logo gleaming behind the head chair where Douglas used to sit. Today, I sat in that chair upright, unshaken. Spencer and Madison arrived together, dressed sharply, faces carved into practiced neutrality. Spencer carried a leather folder he clutched a little too tightly, while Madison's smile was polite, almost saccharine. Behind them were 2 outside consultants, strangers to me but clearly there to look important. I didn't speak first. I wanted to see how they would play it. Spencer cleared his throat, spreading out a stack of documents in front of him. "Mom," he began with a tone of mock kindness. "First, we just want to thank you for everything you've done for the company." "We know how much you've sacrificed, especially recently. But it's been a difficult transition, and Madison and I have been thinking, perhaps it's time to ease your responsibilities." I remained silent, letting him continue, my hands resting calmly on the polished surface. To be clear, Spencer pushed forward. "We're not saying you need to leave. Of course not. You'd still have an honorary title, maybe executive emeritus or founder in residence. We're simply suggesting a more modern leadership approach, more agile decision-making. The company is evolving, and we need to keep pace with the industry." Madison chimed in, her tone sweet as honey. "We thought it would be lovely for you to enjoy a less stressful role. You deserve rest. Douglas would want you to relax." There it was, using Douglas's name as leverage. That was a low blow. Then Spencer dropped the final card. "We've already drafted some preliminary documents to initiate the transfer. Of course, you'll retain a generous compensation package and we'll handle all the legal formalities." He pushed a packet toward me, the consultants nodding like trained lapdogs. I took my time. I looked over the papers without picking them up, eyes moving slowly from Spencer to Madison. The confidence oozed off them. They were so sure they had won. I finally leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. "That's a generous proposal," I said softly. "Very thoughtful of you both." Spencer's chest seemed to puff up. Madison's smile stretched wider. But I continued, "There's just one small oversight you've made." Their smiles faltered just slightly. I stood up slowly, reached into my leather briefcase, and placed a neatly bound folder on the table. It was heavier than the one Spencer brought, its spine thick with the weight of real authority. Spencer's brow furrowed. Madison blinked rapidly. "This," I said, my voice calm, "but carrying unmistakable steel, is the controlling agreement your father and I signed prior to his passing. In it, Douglas clearly states that upon his death, full operational control of Curtis & Company transfers solely to me." I flipped the folder open, letting the glossy signatures and notarized stamps gleam under the overhead lights. Furthermore, I continued flipping another page. Any heir who attempts to forcibly undermine that control or instigate legal interference forfeits their inheritance rights, business and personal assets alike. Spencer's face darkened, his jaw tightening. Madison shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "But you didn't stop there, did you?" I said, my tone sharpening. "You held secret meetings, attempted to solicit outside buyers, misrepresented the company's financial health, and manipulated employees with false narratives about my capacity to lead." Madison's mouth opened and closed, searching for words. Spencer leaned forward, trying to regain control. "We were just looking out for the company, Mom." "You've been under a lot of stress." I cut him off, my voice dropping low and steady. "I have been under pressure before you two ever learned how to spell construction. I negotiated multi-million-dollar deals while you were still crying over broken toys. I signed our first 7-figure contract the same month I was up at 4 a.m., making school lunches. I kept this company alive through recessions, legal battles, and your father's hospital stays while you both were busy. What booking yoga retreats and networking at tennis clubs?" The room fell silent, the weight of my words suffocating. I pressed both hands flat against the table, meeting their shocked gazes directly. "When you were crying for formula, I was standing knee-deep in mud at job sites trying to keep this company afloat. When you needed new shoes for school, I was pulling double shifts to cover payroll so our workers could take home a paycheck. Don't you dare lecture me on leadership. Don't you dare talk to me about Douglas's legacy." Spencer's knuckles turned white around the edge of the table. Madison looked like she wanted to vanish into her designer blazer. I straightened up, gathering the documents and securing them back into my folder. "This meeting is over," I said, my tone final. "From this day forward, I will be exercising full executive authority. Any unauthorized communication with clients, partners, or employees will result in immediate legal action." I pushed back my chair, ready to leave, but then paused, letting the final words sink in. "You came here today expecting to take control from me. You thought I was too old, too weak, too heartbroken. But you forgot who built this empire. You forgot who held this family together. You forgot who kept Curtis & Co. alive while you played at success." I let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Congratulations, kids. This was your first real boardroom lesson." Without waiting for a response, I walked out, head held high. The battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time, I could see it clearly. I wasn't going to be pushed out. I was going to push back. I had thought the ambush in the boardroom would be the final act. I thought maybe after being confronted with the hard truth, Spencer and Madison would back off, lick their wounds, and move on. But I should have known better. Entitlement doesn't go down without a fight, especially when it's been fed for years. Barely a week after shutting them down in the boardroom, I received a notice of legal action. The papers were delivered in person right to my doorstep by a courier who looked almost apologetic as I signed for the thick envelope. The headline on the front page read, "Clear as day. Curtis Vartso Curtis. Petition for emergency conservatorship." I stood in my foyer, staring down at the cold, printed words. My own children were taking me to court, claiming I was mentally unfit to lead the company, that I was experiencing grief-induced delusions, that I was emotionally unstable, incapable of sound business judgment. They wanted the court to remove me from my position immediately to appoint an external conservator, who would unsurprisingly be one of their trusted advisors. It was the lowest blow imaginable. The next few days unfolded like a bad movie. Gossip started leaking to the industry press. Headlines surfaced online, Curtis & Co. though in crisis. Leadership questioned after founder's passing. Anonymous sources spoke about erratic decisions, about unstable transitions. I didn't need to guess where it was coming from. Spencer and Madison were behind it, poisoning the well from every angle they could. My phone rang nonstop. Clients called nervous but polite, asking for reassurance. Industry friends sent me awkward messages, some supportive, others carefully neutral. Employees began whispering in corridors, avoiding eye contact, unsure of where the company or eyes stood. But I stayed calm. I called Evelyn Shaw, my most trusted project director, and asked her to meet me at the office. When she arrived, I didn't have to explain much. She had seen enough over the years to understand exactly what was happening. "They're trying to destabilize us," I said plainly. "Drive away. Our projects rattle our people and paint me as an emotional liability. If they can't win inside the boardroom, they'll burn the walls down from the outside." Evelyn's expression didn't flinch. "Then we hold steady," she said simply. "That's exactly what we did. We reviewed every active project, every pending contract." Evelyn took the lead in reconfirming client relationships, ensuring all deliverables stayed on track, every timeline was met, every promise fulfilled. We made sure no supplier invoices were delayed, no employee paychecks disrupted, no construction site left unattended. Behind the scenes, I worked with Vivian Cross to prepare a bulletproof legal defense. We compiled medical records proving I was in perfect health documentation from 3 independent doctors, a letter from my personal physician who had treated me for over 20 years. Vivian drafted affidavits from employees and clients' testimonials that painted the true picture of my leadership: calm, capable, experienced. And perhaps most importantly, we began feeding the truth back into the public narrative. I reached out to the local press, not the large, hungry media outlets that thrived on scandal, but the small community papers, the reporters who had followed our company's journey for decades. I sat down for interviews, spoke openly about my husband's passing, the transition period, and my commitment to protecting the business, not just for myself, but for every worker who relied on Curtis & Company to feed their families. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Articles appeared with headlines like, "From Widow to Warrior Lorraine Curtis Fights," "To Save Her Family Business," and "The Woman Rebuilding More Than Just Skylines." Industry colleagues who had stayed quiet started reaching out, offering support. Clients who had once seemed hesitant renewed their contracts, placing their trust in the same steady leadership they had known for years. The legal proceedings didn't stop, but their momentum faltered. The day of the preliminary hearing, I walked into the courthouse with my head high, dressed in a tailored navy suit Douglas had always said made me look like I could sell skyscrapers to farmers. Reporters tried to catch my attention, but I kept walking steady and composed. Vivian leaned in before we entered the courtroom. "They've overplayed their hand," she whispered. "They stirred up too much dust without realizing the foundation underneath you is rock solid." Inside, I sat across from Spencer and Madison for the first time since that boardroom clash. Their lawyer rattled off exaggerated claims, waving dramatic language about emotional instability, mental fatigue, erratic business decisions. But every point they raised, Vivian countered with facts: medical evidence, financial records, operational metrics. Then the judge asked the only question that truly mattered. Has the company failed to meet any contractual obligations since the founder's passing? Their lawyer shifted uncomfortably. No. Your Honor, have employees missed pay? Has there been financial mismanagement, legal violations, or operational failures under the defendant's leadership? Again forced to answer truthfully. No. Your Honor, Vivian stood confidently. If anything, Your Honor, Curtis & Cohn has exceeded quarterly targets, secured new contracts, and maintained industry excellence, all under Lorraine Curtis's management. There was a long pause before the judge spoke, her tone firm and unsympathetic. This court sees no grounds to question Mrs. Curtis's competency. Petition for conservatorship is denied. I exhaled slowly, a quiet wave of vindication washing over me. But it wasn't just the legal victory that mattered. It was the quiet applause from the employees waiting in the gallery. It was the handshake from Evelyn when we left the courtroom. It was the message from a client later that evening simply reading, "We knew better." And it was the headline the next morning in our small-town paper that brought a real smile to my face. She built it. She defended it. Curtis & Company remains in the right hands. Spencer and Madison had tried to ruin me. They thought grief would make me weak, that public embarrassment would push me into surrender. But instead it reminded me why I fought in the first place. I wasn't just protecting a company, I was protecting a legacy, a promise, a name Douglas and I had built with sweat and sacrifice. And most importantly, I was protecting the people who actually deserved to be part of it. The war wasn't over yet, but the winds had changed direction, and this time they were blowing firmly at my back. The courthouse on Main Street was older than the company Douglas and I built, with its faded stone walls and creaky wooden benches. It had seen generations of disputes pass through its doors, family feuds, business betrayals, quiet battles fought with polite smiles and sharp contracts, and now it would witness ours. It had taken months of preparation, more hours than I could count in my home office, flipping through binders, reviewing ledgers, and piecing together the defense of my life's work. Vivian Cross stood by me through every step, her silver hair tied in a sharp bun, her tone steady as steel whenever I faltered. The morning of the final hearing, I sat alone in my truck outside the courthouse, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in the cool morning air. The weight of what I was about to face pressed down on me. But there was no fear, not anymore. I had done my grieving. Now I was here to protect what was mine. When I walked into the courtroom, I wasn't alone. Half a dozen employees from Curtis & Cody sat in the back row. Evelyn Shaw among them, along with Mark Ellison and Juan Alvarez. Their presence was quiet but powerful. They hadn't been asked to come. They came because they understood what this fight meant, not just to me, but to all of us. Spencer and Madison sat across from me at the plaintiff's table, dressed impeccably postured confidently, but their eyes betrayed them. They weren't relaxed, they were tense, their movements stiff, their glances brief. Their attorney, a sleek younger man named Robert Findley, adjusted his cufflinks while smiling smugly at the court clerk. He thought this would be easy. After all, when had a grieving widow ever stood a chance against two poised, articulate heirs? The judge, a woman named Harper Wells, took her seat promptly at 9. Her expression was firm, almost unreadable. She had seen it all before, but today's case wasn't just another name in her docket. It was Curtis v. Curtis, a battle for legacy. The courtroom settled, and the trial began. Robert Findley was first to speak. He strode confidently to the center of the courtroom, voice, smooth words dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, this is not a matter of disrespect or greed. My clients Spencer and Madison are merely concerned about their mother's well-being. Since the unfortunate passing of their father, Douglas Curtis, Mrs. Lorraine Curtis has demonstrated significant instability, rash business decisions, emotional volatility, and a sudden desire to restructure the company in a way that jeopardizes its future." I listened, expression blank, watching as he spun a story built on half-truths and bold-faced lies. Vivian stood next, walking with the grace of a woman who had spent decades battling men like Robert Findley. "Your Honor," she began, her voice rich and unwavering. "What my opposing counsel has neglected to mention is that Mrs. Lorraine Curtis is not simply the widow of Douglas Curtis. She is the co-founder of Curtis & Compton's. She has led this company for over 3 decades, including during Douglas's years of declining health. Since his passing, the company has not faltered. It has flourished." She walked the judge through recent quarterly reports, each one showing growth, stability, and on-target projections. She laid out performance charts, profit margins, and client retention rates. Every number contradicted Spencer and Madison's claims of instability. Robert Findley tried to interrupt with objections, but the judge raised a hand, allowing Vivian to proceed. Vivian continued. "The plaintiffs claim emotional volatility. Yet we have medical affidavits from 3 independent physicians confirming Mrs. Curtis is of sound body and mind with no cognitive impairments, no mental health conditions that could in any way hinder her capacity to lead." Then she reached for another binder, this one heavier, thicker, marked Evidence D. And most importantly, Vivian said, her tone sharpening, We have documented proof that the plaintiffs, rather than acting in the interest of the company, have been actively attempting to destabilize it, spreading misinformation approaching buyers without authority and providing false financial statements to potential investors in an effort to force a sale and push their mother out. The judge leaned forward for the first time, eyes narrowing. Vivian called the first witness. It was Evelyn Shaw. Evelyn walked up with quiet determination, swearing in before taking the stand. Vivian led her through a series of questions about day-to-day operations, about Lorraine's leadership, about the company's performance since Douglas's death. Evelyn spoke plainly. Mrs. Curtis hasn't missed a payroll since Douglas passed. She hasn't lost a client. If anything, morale has improved. Leadership is clearer. The company is stronger than it's been in years. Then Vivian asked the most important question. In your professional opinion, what would happen to Curtis & Co. without Mrs. Curtis leading it? Evelyn didn't hesitate. It would crumble. Because Spencer and Madison don't understand this business. They've never walked a site, they've never handled a project crisis, they've never stood in the trenches with the crews. They see numbers on a spreadsheet. Lorraine sees the people. Robert tried to shake Evelyn during cross-examination, but Evelyn held her ground like a rock in a storm. More witnesses followed. Clients, contractors, veteran employees, all painting the same picture, a capable, steady leader holding the company together, while her children plotted behind her back. Finally, Judge Wells called for a recess. When we returned, the courtroom was heavier, the atmosphere more somber. The judge spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the room. I have reviewed the financial records, listened to testimonies, and assessed the character of all parties involved. There is no credible evidence to suggest Mrs. Curtis is incapable of leading her company. On the contrary, the evidence overwhelmingly shows responsible, consistent, and even thriving leadership. Spencer shifted uncomfortably. Madison's expression cracked. But what troubles this court, Judge Wells continued, is the documented attempts by the plaintiffs to misrepresent financial data, interfere with company operations, and manipulate outside entities for personal gain. She paused, letting the silence settle. This court not only denies the petition for conservatorship, the judge declared, but refers this case to the district attorney's office for further investigation into potential fraud and attempted corporate sabotage. The courtroom was stunned. Spencer's jaw clenched, Madison's head dropped, and Robert Findley's confident posture deflated in real time. Meanwhile, I sat still calm, but my heart pulsed with quiet victory. I hadn't needed to shout. I hadn't needed to rage. The truth had spoken loud enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, but I walked past them without a word, past the cameras, past the microphones. Inside my chest, there was a steady rhythm. A quiet song of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Dignity restored. Justice delivered. And for the first time since Douglas passed, I could breathe fully again. I arrived at Curtis & Company early that morning, before the usual buzz of the office kicked in, before the crews clocked in on job sites, before the coffee brewed in the break room. The air was still calm, almost like the company itself was waiting for me to make my move. For weeks I had kept my head down and followed every step of the legal process. Now it was time to speak. Not in courtrooms, not in depositions, but in the heart of the company Douglas and I built from dirt and sweat. It was time for the people who mattered to hear the truth from me directly. I scheduled an all-staff meeting, mandatory attendance, and booked out the largest conference room. Word spread fast. By noon, every chair was filled, standing room packed along the walls. Site supervisors came in from job sites, office employees shut their laptops, even warehouse teams showed up in their dusty work boots. As I stood at the front of the room, I looked out at the sea of faces, some young, some older, some who had been here since the beginning. I spotted Evelyn near the front, Mark nodding reassuringly, Juan standing quietly with his arms folded. These were the people who had built Curtis & Co. These were the people who deserved to know what came next. I took a steadying breath and spoke. I know the last few months haven't been easy. I began, my voice calm but firm. You've heard the rumors. You've seen the headlines. You've watched people you thought you could trust try to tear down what we built." There was a murmur through the crowd, nods, frowns, eyes tightening in quiet anger. "I won't sugarcoat it," I continued. "My own children attempted to dismantle this company. They tried to sell it off, line their pockets, and discard everything we worked for. And they did it while standing on the gravesite of the man who dedicated his life to this company." The room went silent, heavy with the weight of the truth. "But they failed," I said simply. "They failed because they underestimated every single one of you. They forgot who really keeps this company running. And they forgot who I am." I reached into the folder I had brought with me and held up 2 sheets of paper. "Effective immediately," I said, my tone unwavering. "Spencer Curtis and Madison. Curtis are terminated from Curtis & Co. They are no longer employees. Their company privileges have been revoked. Access, revoked accounts, frozen. They will no longer have any involvement with our operations, nor any claim to this business." A ripple of whispers surged through the room. I held up my hand. "But it doesn't end there." I set the papers down and picked up a thicker stack bound in a deep navy cover. "As of today, Curtis & Company will begin transitioning to an employee-owned company. This is no longer just my company. It will belong to every person who has carried bricks, driven forklifts, drafted blueprints, closed contracts, and worked through storms to keep us alive." The silence broke like a dam. I could see it, eyes widening, mouths parting in disbelief. Whispers grew louder, gasps cut through the tension. I smiled, letting the truth settle. "For those of you who have stood by this company for 5, 10, 20 years, you will become shareholders. Your loyalty will not go unnoticed. Your efforts will not go unrewarded. We're building something that will outlive boardroom takeovers entitled heirs and corporate greed. Curtis & Company will belong to those who built it, not those who tried to steal it." I could see Evelyn's chin trembling as she blinked away tears. Mark wiped at his eye, roughly pretending it was a cough. Juan stood straighter, pride swelling in his expression. I continued. "Over the coming months, we will implement a full employee stock ownership program. You will have the right to vote on leadership decisions, but you will have a stake in the profits. You will have a voice in the company's direction. And no one, not even me, will ever be allowed to jeopardize this legacy again." The applause started slowly, a few claps from the back, then more from the sides. And suddenly it surged loud and proud, a chorus of cheers, claps, and even a few hoots and whistles echoing against the walls. I let the sound wash over me. That beautiful sound of people realizing their hard work finally meant ownership. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been knotted since the day I buried Douglas. I didn't let myself cry in front of them, but I felt the tears threaten as I spoke the last few words. This company will no longer be defined by bloodline. It will be defined by backbone, by the hands that build the minds that create, and the hearts that stay loyal even in the storm. The room erupted again, louder this time, people standing to their feet, some clapping, some wiping away tears, others hugging. As the meeting ended, people lined up, not to shake my hand like I was some distant executive, but to hug me, to thank me, to say things like, "You saved us," and Douglas would be proud, and this is what real leadership looks like. And they were right, not because I was stronger or smarter than my children, but because I understood what they never did. Loyalty is earned, not inherited. Later that afternoon, I walked into my office alone, closed the door, and sat in Douglas's chair, the one I had avoided for months. I looked out at the yard where new crews were gearing up for their next job, trucks being loaded, blueprints being checked, hard hats flashing in the sunlight. I thought about Spencer and Madison, how their greed had blinded them, how they thought I would crumble, how they believed I was weak, because I was grieving. And I smiled, quiet and certain. I didn't just survive, I won. And I wasn't winning for myself anymore. I was winning for every soul who had ever shown up before sunrise, who had stayed late to finish a project, who had skipped holidays to meet deadlines, who had kept Curtis & Co. alive. For the first time since Douglas passed, I felt at peace. Not because the battle was over, but because I had chosen the right people to fight for. The company was safe. The family I chose was safe. And I was finally free. A year later, if you had walked into the offices of Curtis & Co., you wouldn't have recognized it. The walls were brighter, the energy sharper, the smiles wider. It wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a home people built together. There was laughter in the hallways, pride on every project site, and a quiet dignity in every handshake. Curtis & Company wasn't surviving. It was thriving. We didn't just recover. We transformed. The employee ownership model turned out to be the best decision of my life. Every quarterly report showed not just stable profits, but rising ones. Clients returned with confidence, new contracts rolled in, and employee retention rates soared. For the first time in company history, teams worked not just for a paycheck, but for a stake in their future. Every few months, I stood before the employees, sharing updates, celebrating milestones. Each time the room felt fuller, not because of numbers, but because of something deeper: ownership, purpose, community. We rebuilt something stronger than what was taken from us. Curtis & Co. even landed on a national list of top 50 most inspiring employee-owned businesses. Reporters came through our doors wanting to know the story. Journalists scribbled notes as they asked how a woman nearing retirement age had not just survived a hostile family takeover, but turned her company into a model of sustainable leadership. And when they asked, I always said the same thing. Because I finally chose the right family, the one that shows up every day, rain or shine. But not everyone's year was so generous. Spencer's ambitions collapsed faster than he ever imagined. The startup he jumped into after the lawsuit folded in 6 months, taking every dime of his personal investment with it. I heard through acquaintances that he was scrambling, hopping from short-term consulting jobs, his once bright LinkedIn profile growing quieter with each passing month. The same boardrooms where he once strutted now closed their doors to him. Madison's downfall wasn't as public, but it was steady. The marketing firm that had always valued her connections quickly realized her network had crumbled. Her attempts to secure a director role floundered when companies looked deeper into her background. Whispers of unethical tactics followed her interviews, and by the end of the year her resume was gathering dust, and her phone calls went unanswered. They never reached out again, not with apologies, not with explanations. And I never reached out to them. Not out of bitterness, but because I had finally learned that sometimes peace means walking away without looking back. I didn't just survive the storm, I outgrew it. I found myself becoming more than the woman I had been. Invitations started arriving. Speaking engagements at women's leadership conferences, features in industry spotlights, requests for interviews about resilience, business ownership, and reclaiming personal power. I said yes to many, not because I wanted applause, but because I wanted to be the voice I never had when I felt like I was drowning. I stood on stages in packed conference halls, telling rooms full of women that it was never too late to take back their dignity. I told them about sacrifice, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your name. And every time someone approached me afterward with teary eyes and a shaky smile saying, "Thank you," I needed to hear that. And for the first time in decades, I made time for me. One afternoon, while reviewing our latest quarterly bonuses, I caught sight of an old sticky note tucked between folders on my desk. It was faded, but still legible in Douglas's handwriting from years ago. Don't forget Italy. Italy. It had always been a dream of ours. Douglas used to joke that we would take a long trip there when we finally had a slow season. But slow seasons never came. There was always another contract, another expansion, another crisis that needed fixing. Now, with the company in strong, capable hands and my heart finally at peace, I decided it was time. I booked the trip that evening. 2 full weeks exploring Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast. No work calls, no emergency emails, just me, a suitcase, and a promise fulfilled. The flight to Italy felt like shedding skin. I watched the clouds roll by from the airplane window, thinking of the version of myself who had been afraid to dream beyond the next responsibility. That version was gone. Italy was everything I had imagined and more. I stood beneath the arches of the Colosseum, feeling history wrap around me. I walked cobblestone streets, sipped strong espresso in tucked-away cafes, and listened to strangers laugh in a language that felt like music. I gazed at Michelangelo's David and stood silently in the Sistine Chapel, letting beauty sink into places that had been empty for too long. One morning in Positano, as the ocean glittered under the rising sun, I took out Douglas's photo from my wallet, placed it next to my cappuccino, and whispered, "We made it." I didn't cry. I smiled. I spent those weeks rediscovering the pieces of myself I had buried under years of sacrifice. I learned to take long walks without checking my phone to savor meals, without rushing to feel joy without guilt. When I returned home, Curtis & Company was still standing tall, proving what I always knew. When you build something on integrity and hard work, it doesn't fall just because you finally take a breath. I hung a photo of Italy in my office, not just as a memory of a trip fulfilled, but as a reminder that life doesn't end after betrayal, after loss, after hardship. Sometimes life begins again, stronger, brighter, freer. And as I sat at my desk reviewing plans for the next employee profit-sharing initiative, I realized I wasn't just writing business strategies anymore. I was writing a whole new chapter of my life, one that belonged entirely to me. There comes a point in life when silence no longer feels empty. It feels like peace. For the first time in my life, my mornings weren't dictated by alarms blaring at dawn or endless back-to-back meetings. My days began with slow, quiet moments. Watching the sunrise filter through my kitchen window, sipping coffee without rushing, listening to the world awaken on its own time. Curtis & Company was thriving without me having to be on the front lines every hour of every day. The employees, my real family, had taken the reins with pride, steering the company forward with fresh energy and unwavering respect for the foundation we had built. They still sent me updates, invited me to the big meetings, asked for advice when big decisions loomed. But they didn't need me to hold everything together anymore. That was the beauty of building something real. It grew stronger when you let it go. My home, once filled with the tension of family politics and the heaviness of betrayal, had become my haven. The rooms that once echoed with my frustrations now held the soft sound of music, the quiet rustling of pages from books I'd always wanted to read, the comforting hum of a life lived on my own terms. I walked past the guest room that used to be reserved for Spencer's family. It remained untouched, not from anger, but from closure. There were no more calls, no more empty apologies, no last-ditch attempts to reconcile, and I no longer needed them. There was no bitterness left inside me. Just acceptance. I hadn't lost a family. I had found myself. There were new routines, too. Saturday morning markets where I picked fresh flowers just because they made me smile, community events where people came up to me not as the widow of Douglas Curtis, but as the woman who turned everything around, and evenings where I took long walks along the lake, breathing in peace instead of stress. One crisp fall evening, I found myself standing on the shore of Seabrook Beach, not far from the old marina Douglas loved. The sky was streaked with soft pink and orange. The waves whispered gently across the sand, and the air tasted of salt and freedom. In my hand was a glass of rich red wine, the kind Douglas always ordered on our rare nights out. I swirled it slowly, letting the sea breeze kiss my cheeks. It was our anniversary that day. Would have been 33 years. The ache of his absence never fully disappeared, but it had softened. What remained wasn't pain. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the years we had, for the dreams we dared to chase, for the legacy we built together. Gratitude for the woman I became because of those years and sometimes despite them. I raised my glass toward the horizon, the sun dipping lower. "I didn't just keep your promise," I whispered softly, my voice carried away by the breeze. "I lived it, and I'm still living, for both of us." I stood there for a long time, feeling him beside me, not as a memory, but as a quiet presence woven into every strong choice I had made. There was no need for revenge anymore. No need to waste precious breaths on those who didn't value me. I had learned the most powerful lesson of all, that dignity doesn't come from others. It's something you claim for yourself. And standing there, feeling the sand under my feet and the wind in my hair, I realized something even greater. Women are told too often that their worth fades with age, that their power diminishes after loss, that their relevance disappears when they no longer serve others. But the truth is simpler, clearer, more liberating than any of those lies. We are only limited when we forget our own worth. We are only trapped when we believe the world's small definitions of us. And we are only powerless when we surrender our voice. I hadn't just reclaimed my voice. I had built a life where it echoed louder, steadier, truer than ever before. As the final rays of sun kissed the ocean, I took a sip of wine and smiled to myself. Because the girl who once stood in construction boots on muddy sites had become a woman who built empires. The woman who once sacrificed herself for everyone else had become someone who honored her own heart first. And the widow who was expected to crumble had become the matriarch of a living, breathing legacy, one that would outlast every storm, every betrayal, every loss. That night, as I walked back toward the cozy cottage I now called home, I felt no loneliness, just freedom. And I knew deep in my bones that this was only the beginning of a life finally lived for me. Because age is just a number, loss is just a chapter, but dignity is forever. Before I close this chapter, I want to ask you, have you ever felt like your sacrifices were invisible? Like the people you loved the most were the very ones who took you for granted? Maybe you've been there, standing quietly while others decided your worth. Or maybe you've felt that same fire inside, realizing it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Your struggles, your strength, your quiet victories. Because here your voice matters. And if these stories speak to your heart, if they remind you of your own resilience, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you'll never miss a story that lifts you up, reminds you of your worth, and keeps you company through life's quiet moments. Your journey isn't over, and neither are these stories. I'll be right here waiting to share the next one with you.